Blinkist is the app that helps you become a more well-rounded person by letting you read or listen to an entire nonfiction book in just 15 minutes. You can try it for free and get 25% off a subscription by going to Blinkist.com/David Pakman. The Joe Biden White House is now facing what is absolutely the biggest foreign policy crisis of the still relatively new presidency and administration of the Biden White House. There has been an absolutely terrible terrorist attack in Kabul, Afghanistan. This is part of the broader context of Joe Biden deciding to make good, essentially, on the plan that Donald Trump claimed to have. Now, of course, Donald Trump ultimately did not leave Afghanistan, essentially ran out of time. But as far as we knew, planned to leave, just like Joe Biden ultimately decided to do. And this is one of those areas where if you are looking for the sort of simplistic, black or white, Manichaean analysis of what is going on in Afghanistan, there's plenty of places to get that. There's no question about it. And we've seen many of those simplistic analyses come from the usual suspects, the paid political consultants on both right and left for different reasons. We've seen them come from the military industrial complex friendly, generally pro-war corporate media. And by pro-war, I don't mean they want war per se, but they want conflict and salaciousness, and they know that military conflicts generate ratings. And unfortunately, all of those analyses fall short, and there's good and there's bad and there's right and there's wrong. And it actually requires a little bit more thinking in order to get something approximating a view that considers a totality of what is going on. So we'll work backwards. Thursday, 2 explosions happened in an area right by the Kabul airport. This is an airport that has become a central location in what is now taking place in Afghanistan, which is many people trying to leave. There are Americans trying to leave. There are locals trying to leave and seek asylum or refugee status in the United States and elsewhere, as you are seeing the Taliban increasingly prevent people from leaving to some degree. And also now we have introduced ISIS claiming responsibility for the 2 explosions. These were suicide bombings. As of this morning, the latest numbers were 182 people killed, including 169 Afghan civilians and 13 members of the United States military. These are the first military casualties in Afghanistan since February of 2020. Joe Biden was meeting the remains of the 13 deceased American military members when they arrived in the United States over the weekend. So let's go through each item here because, it's actually kind of a bummer. I know that we're going to get really simple black or white analysis from most in the media. The right is saying this is all terrible because Biden's incompetent and Trump would have done it great. Well, no, he would have. Well, no, he would not have. Some on the left are saying this was carried out the wrong way. Biden was wrong to leave, or just this is perfect and everything has been gone swimmingly. All of these takes fall short. Joe Biden was 100% correct to leave Afghanistan. Doesn't change anything about that. Joe Biden was completely right to leave Afghanistan. This does not mean, as a result of this terrorist attack, that we go back in. My preference, right? Of course, we might. I don't believe it means we go back in, but it does mean that Joe Biden has a crisis to deal with here. Now, for those saying this crisis is what's tanking Joe Biden's approval, and this crisis is going to prevent Democrats from winning in 2022, I disagree, and I disagree on both. And we're going to go into that more tomorrow, the political implications of this. Part of it is voters have a very short-term memory. Part of it is foreign policy actually matters surprisingly little when it comes to how people vote in elections in the United States. We'll get back to that. But the fact that after just a few days of the United States pulling back, you have the Taliban taking over, and then you have ISIS versus the Taliban, this actually reinforces how completely untenable our involvement was in Afghanistan. We have to stay forever in order to prevent this. That's proof that we shouldn't be involved. since the only way to keep things even relatively calm, apparently, is to stay involved indefinitely. It's not viable. It's not viable unless you believe in the United States as the never-ending policeman of the world, which I don't. That's not my foreign policy view. I thought it wasn't the view of a lot of Trumpists when it was Trump saying we're going to get out of there. Now, all of a sudden, those same people have changed their mind. I have not changed my mind on this. Trump should have left. Biden did leave. Obama should have left, but he didn't. Okay. Now, of course, the right is going after Joe Biden. Well, yeah, Joe Biden's a Democrat. They're going to go after Joe Biden. Yes, this is a crisis, but it would have been the same crisis under Donald Trump. We're seeing all the normal experts on foreign policy come forward and say, oh, we should have stayed. This is a humiliation for Biden. Should have gotten out differently. I have a completely different perspective without denying that this has not gone well, because it hasn't gone well. We rarely see presidents act this decisively in getting us out of a commitment around the world. When presidents act decisively, it's usually to start an incursion, and it's considered patriotic by the right. When George W. Bush said, on my order, we have started attacks in Iraq after 9/11 and all of this. Wow, decisive and powerful. Well, hold on a second. Is it decisive and powerful to start an incursion without actually thinking through the consequences, the way George W. Bush did? This is the opposite, but it is decisive. Joe Biden has drawn a line and is getting us out of what George W. Bush started, what Barack Obama didn't end, what Donald Trump didn't end. Biden is ending it in the first year of his presidency, and that's good. And the situation has become very chaotic, and now Joe Biden has to figure out what to do. But remember that the status quo before we left was not some utopia for the Afghan population. 200,000 Afghans killed since we went in. It's been chaotic for years in Afghanistan, but nobody was paying attention. And now suddenly people are saying it only just got chaotic because Joe Biden decided to leave. That's wrong. It got more chaotic without a doubt. And now we have pundits and so-called experts saying the least interesting things. Just stay. Stay for a month, stay for a year, stay for another 20 years. How is that even considered remotely serious? Unless your view of American foreign policy is uber interventionist. That's not my foreign policy. Joe Biden did a good thing by leaving. Left, right, and corporate media in their own ways are slamming him, but the decision was the right one. Now you have to figure out what to do with the chaos. All the same people who ignored this for decades are now jumping in like they've been paying attention and saying we should be staying, or we should have left this way, or we should have left. Give me a break, guys. This is the same media that mostly rode willingly into George W. Bush's Iraq war, who are now saying, oh, let's stay in Afghanistan. Give me a break. There are real problems. I don't understate for a second the dire situation that is happening in Afghanistan. Life lost, tragedy. But we've had that for 20 years and barely a peep from a lot of these same people now. It's a cynical, uninformed attempt to just go after Joe Biden. Joe Biden deserves criticism in all of this, but leaving was the right decision. Trump should have left. Obama should have left. Resist the urge to demand that something be either perfect or terrible. Okay? Reality is more complicated, and it's too complicated for the really predictable, boring hot takes that we are seeing, including from all sorts of corporate media with various different political stripes. We're going to keep talking about it this week. By the way, one last thing. I got a few emails from people saying, David, why haven't you talked about Afghanistan? The first week of this crisis, I was gone. I just wasn't here. My guest hosts talked about it. Since getting back, I've done 9 segments on Afghanistan. This today is number 10. Give me a break, guys. Find something else to complain about. Okay, let's talk about what is increasingly likely going to be the addition of the COVID-19 vaccine to school requirements, school vaccination requirements if kids want to go to public schools. Now, why am I wording it this way? Because most states, every state, already has a list of vaccines that are required for students to attend public school. And we're going to talk about this in some detail. The news that is getting people all worked up is a report that Dr. Anthony Fauci backs a COVID-19 mandate for U.S. school children. Reuters reporting on this, choosing a terrible picture of Anthony Fauci looking like he's doing a Nazi salute. Why this picture was chosen, I don't know. But the report from Reuters is Dr. Fauci, top U.S. infectious disease expert, said Sunday he supports COVID vaccine mandates for children attending schools as the highly contagious Delta variant of the coronavirus continues to fuel a surge in cases in the nation. Let's take a look at Dr. Fauci himself saying it yesterday on CNN, remembering, of course, that children under 12 aren't even eligible yet. This is Dr. Fauci saying what he would support, but the vaccine isn't even approved for kids under 12 yet. Let's take a look.
I believe that mandating vaccines for children to appear in school is a good idea. And remember, Jake, this is not something new. We have mandates in many places in schools, particularly public schools, that if in fact you want a child to come in, we've done this for decades and decades, requiring polio, measles, mumps, rubella, hepatitis. So this would not be something new, requiring vaccinations for children to come to school.
So this makes sense, and it's really not even remotely controversial. We're just adding a vaccine. We would be, if this happened, we would just be adding another vaccine to the list of vaccines that are required for public school kids. This is a vaccine that the Pfizer vaccine is now approved by the FDA. And part of what the right does is create fear and outrage and uncertainty and doubt over non-controversial things. And this is good. These are going to be the next battle lines. If you look at the state of Texas, a bill was introduced in the Texas legislature to add the COVID vaccine to the required school vaccine list. There was another bill introduced in Texas that goes directly counter, which would ban adding the COVID vaccine as a required vaccine for schools. So we're going to see where that goes in Texas. Texas, of course, has a right-wing legislature, and it will probably be the latter rather than the former. But it is important to remember that a whole bunch of states already have these rules. Let's start with the liberal state of New York. When you look at New York, you see very clearly you need the DTP vaccine. That's diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. If you're going to pre-K, you need 4 doses. For kindergarten through grade 5, you need 5 or 4 doses, or 3, depending on the age of the kids. For grades 6 to 12, you need 3 doses of the DTP. Polio vaccine, 3 doses or 4 based on the age. MMR, kids in pre-K need a dose of MMR. Everybody beyond that needs 2 doses. Hep B is on the list. Varicella, chickenpox vaccine, now required. Once you get to grade 7, you need the meningococcal vaccine. Okay, the point here is New York already has a list of all of these vaccines. They're just there's no new structure. It's just add the COVID vaccine to that. Now, if you say, well, sir, New York, very liberal state, let's look instead at the state of Alabama. Alabama, if you look, also has this requirement, and it's kind of strict. Look at this. The state of Alabama does not recognize philosophical, moral, or ethical exemption from vaccination. A medical exemption may be issued by a physician, or an Alabama religious exemption may be obtained. Some states have even done away with religious exemptions, but Alabama is already pretty tight on this. And then look at the list. Attendees of daycare and Head Start must be vaccinated against diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, measles, mumps, rubella, influenza type B, polio, and chickenpox. We're just talking about adding one more vaccine, and I could go on and give you more requirements for older kids. So when we talk about this issue, it's really important not to let them frame the battle lines as we're going from nothing to mandating a vaccine. No, we're going, in theory, from mandating 6 or 7 vaccines to adding a 7th or 8th that's just been approved by the FDA. Don't let them set the terms of the debate. And we will ultimately see where this goes. But remember, it's not even approved for kids under 12 yet. There is the next step would be 5 to 11, and that's being evaluated right now. This is going to be a fight, but it's going to be a necessary one, sadly, because of the level of ignorance that we have in the United States. Let me know what you think will ultimately happen with these school vaccine mandates. Find me on Twitter at dpacman. We are getting dangerously close to 1 billion YouTube views. When we get there, we're at 998 million. When we get to 1 billion YouTube views, we'll be sending out an email blast with a great membership special. Get on our newsletter to be notified at davidpacman.com. What if you could read 10 books in just one sitting? That's exactly what one of my favorite apps lets you do. It's called Blinkist, and what they do is take thousands of popular nonfiction books. They condense them down into text or audio that you can consume in 15 minutes. Blinkist makes sure that you're getting all of the important core insights from each book. So it's perfect for exploring a book you otherwise wouldn't have time for. If there's a full book you're thinking about buying, you can use Blinkist to get a sample first. Just think how much you can enrich yourself by being able to soak up an entire nonfiction book in just 15 minutes. I recently read A Brief History of Time, of course, by the great Stephen Hawking. This is a book that I have been aware of for so long, and other things got in the way, and it was fantastic to check it out on Blinkist. Blinkist has books on politics, philosophy, science. They have 27 different nonfiction categories, and a subscription is only about $8 a month, and you get the entire library. But you can try it totally free and get 25% off a subscription when you go to Blinkist.com/David Pacman. I've put the link right underneath this video. Remember that the David Pacman Show is funded by viewers like you, by podcast listeners like you. The podcast, by the way, I don't know what's going on with the audio podcasts, but we are back to sort of like election 2020 levels with the daily audio podcast downloads. I don't know what's causing it, but we love it. Regardless, wherever you listen, wherever you watch, you can grab a membership at joinpacman.com and get instant access to the extra daily show. It's an additional show every day. For our members, sign up at joinpacman.com. You've got a coupon code BETTER21 that you can use anytime and save bigly off of that membership. Hey, I want to call your attention to something maybe you forgot about. Does everybody remember when a few months ago, the corporate media decided that now we have to talk about the lab leak theory of COVID, and we all have to say, hey, could it have been made in a Chinese laboratory as a bioweapon? Could it accidentally have leaked from the lab? And of course, some of us, like me, had all along been saying the exact same thing. Investigate everything. Why would we, without investigating, say something is true or isn't true? Let's investigate the origins of COVID. But until we have evidence that it came from a lab or was deliberately made and released as a bioweapon, until we have evidence for that, it would be irresponsible to suggest that that is likely. And that's what I said in 2020. And that's what I said in early 2021. And it's what I said a few months ago when the story was raging. But for some reason, a few months ago, the story was everywhere in the media. And it was framed as, why are some, like Dr. Fauci and the left, whoever, why are people covering up and preventing an investigation into the lab leak theory? Now, the reality was just about everybody was saying, sure, investigate it. Look into it. But we just don't have evidence right now that that's actually what took place. But the cover-up hypothesis is prototypical of how you generate more media interest. You not only float an idea, but you claim that the idea is being suppressed, that the idea is being covered up. And this actually worked because a couple months ago, members of the media actually started asking Joe Biden and Biden administration officials about it. They would ask Jen Psaki in the press briefing room, Jen, does the Biden administration oppose investigating what the origins? No, it doesn't oppose. We're fine with an investigation. I think it was Peter Doocy, who asked Joe Biden about it. And Joe Biden said, investigate, go ahead and investigate. And just about everybody was saying, we don't rule out anything. Let's find out. But we don't yet have evidence that that's the case. Now, here's the really important part in understanding these media cycles. When this bubbled up a couple of months ago and Joe Biden was asked about it, and so was Jen Psaki, there was no new evidence at that time that would make us say, this now looks much more likely, so let's ask about it. It came in and then it suddenly went away and it became a non-story. It may come back again. At no point was there really any reason to think that COVID was a bioweapon that came from a lab. It's just the perfect prototypical example of how something becomes a story in the media and then just as quickly the story goes away and we don't even really understand why. And this was the case all along. And then very quietly, a few days ago, we got a new report published, written about in Nature, which explains that, quote, the intelligence investigation is inconclusive on virus's origins, but finds it wasn't weaponized and it is unlikely to have been engineered. According to the declassified key takeaways issued by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and the intelligence community more broadly, it's been assessed that the COVID virus likely first appeared in Wuhan no later than November of 2019, emerged without the knowledge of Chinese authorities, and was not developed as a bioweapon. Most agencies also agreed, though with low confidence, that it was probably not genetically engineered, although two agencies believe we don't yet have enough evidence to say for sure. So when you read it, if you read it with the conspiratorial mind, you say this is part of the cover up. They're sort of not closing the door completely to the possibility, but if you actually look at it for what it is, understand that for a very long time, there was fear, uncertainty, and doubt generated around the idea that the true origins were being covered up. The truth is, we never had evidence to believe that this was bioengineered or leaked from a lab or released as a bioweapon. We didn't have evidence for that. We couldn't rule it out. Sometimes in science, you can't rule things out, but you don't have evidence for them. That allowed for people to weaponize the hypothesis, to attack others, to claim that there were bad liberal people lying and covering this up. And I am still open to the possibility that this was being studied and it leaked or whatever. I don't think we should put any kind of limitation on studying it, but we don't have evidence for it. And it's very similar to the use of the migrant caravan stories or stories of Middle Eastern terrorists coming through the U.S.-Mexico border. All these things are physically possible. They're theoretically possible. Someone could go from the Middle East to Guatemala and then come to Mexico and physically cross the U.S.-Mexico border. We don't actually have evidence that that's going on. And there's this churn of unverifiable rage-inducing propaganda. There are legitimate questions about the exact chemistry of the Wuhan strains and about events at the Wuhan lab. It's been discussed in reputable media. Let's investigate it. There is no reason right now to think that it came from a lab, just like before. So how much are we going to sort of repeat the same story absent that evidence? Now, one other thing, there's another important thing. When people say, this is being discussed everywhere online, like, how is this not a serious story? The discussion online is biased towards controversy and conspiracy. You just have to understand that. And that's important when we talk about the baseline of a lot of these discussions. But the perfect example, the story came 2 months ago and then it went, and we still don't have more evidence that any of those hypotheses are true. I'm going to play a couple of clips for you here of a statement and an interview that Donald Trump produced and gave a few days ago in relation to what's going on in Afghanistan. And I have to tell you, if a Democratic president had downplayed 9/11 and Osama bin Laden the way that Donald Trump does in this interview, they would be getting covered on Fox News as unpatriotic traitors 24 hours a day, probably for a week or longer. OK, let's take a listen to this first clip. This is Donald Trump on the Sean Hannity program.
Look at al-Baghdadi. He was the founder of ISIS. We took him out. Nobody could find him for 15 years. Far bigger than Osama bin Laden, far bigger. Osama bin Laden, bad, and he hit, the World Trade Center, and it was a horrible thing. But al-Baghdadi was the founder of ISIS.
So there is Donald Trump downplaying 9/11, saying what's the core of this? Obama got Osama, and Trump wants to say, I did better, I did more, as well as justify the idea, unfounded, that had he overseen the withdrawal from Afghanistan rather than Joe Biden, it would have gone much better. We have no evidence to suggest that. Everything Trump did turned to crap. So there's no reason to believe that Donald Trump would have handled the retreat from Afghanistan any better than did Joe Biden. But Trump is downplaying the importance of Osama bin Laden's capture and being killed, and downplaying by virtue of doing that 9/11. If a Democratic president did this, they would be calling for the head of such a Democrat. Donald Trump also during this interview talking about ISIS-X, which sounds like a band more than a terrorist group. Take a listen to this.
And ISIS-X, as you know, I knocked out 100% of the ISIS caliphate. I knocked it out in Syria, Iraq. We knocked it out. So now they have a new ISIS called ISIS-X.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think back. I might have gone to high school, in fact, with the with the bassist for ISIS-X. Anyway, here is Donald Trump then in talking about ending the war in Afghanistan. He actually says he did want to keep troops there. Take a listen to this.
But we had to get out with dignity. We had to take our $80 billion worth of equipment. We had to do all of the things that we had to do. And then I would have blown up all the air bases, but I would have kept Bagram, because Bagram's located right next to China, right near China and Iran. And it's in Afghanistan. So we had the whole group covered. They spent $10 billion building it, and we handed out the keys.
So understand how amazing that is. For all the talk about Trump was going to get us out, which he failed to do, for all of that talk, and then now the criticism, which I think is a fair criticism, I don't want Biden sending people back in. But for all the criticism of saying Joe got us out and caused chaos, but then he's also not really getting us out because he's sending people back in, Trump is admitting there, I would have kept people there to keep Bagram. We would have done it. So even Trump's full removal of troops from Afghanistan, he admits there, would not even actually have been a full removal. And the most important point here is there's no empirical reason to think that Donald Trump would have done a good job. There's no historical reason. Last thing, Trump put out a statement about Afghanistan, one of these direct to camera things, and it was published on Fox News' Sean Hannity program. Why? Maybe because Trump has lost access to all of his other platforms for spreading disinformation. I don't know. But let's take a listen to a little bit of that.
As one nation, America mourns the loss of our brave and brilliant American service members in a savage and barbaric terrorist attack in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
These noble American warriors laid down their lives in the line of duty. They sacrificed themselves for the country that they loved, racing against time to rescue their fellow citizens from harm's way. They died as American heroes, and our nation will honor their memory forever. I want to express my deepest condolences to the families of those we have lost. Today, all Americans grieve alongside you. Together, we also pray that God will heal the other courageous American service members who were wounded in this heinous attack. In addition, our hearts are with the families of all the innocent civilians who died, and with the many men, women, and children who were terribly injured in this act of evil. This tragedy should never have taken place. It should never have happened, and it would not have happened if I were your president.
And of course, it almost certainly would have happened if Donald Trump were president. So the important points here are, as I mentioned at the top of the show, this is the perfect story for Monday morning quarterbacking. Getting out of Afghanistan was the right decision by Joe Biden. It was a decisive decision, and predictably, it led to chaos. Go back to my clips about when Donald Trump was looking at doing this. It predictably led to chaos and tragedy and death, and that has to be dealt with. And Joe Biden has a crisis on his hands. But this idea that Trump would have done it right is an absolutely pathetic, bogus idea for which we have no evidence at all. There's simply no reason to think Trump would have handled this well, because he handled nothing well. We'll have more on this on the David Pakman Show Instagram. Find us there at David Pakman Show. Don't forget that the best way to support the David Pakman Show is by becoming a member, which gives you access to the daily bonus show, the regular show with no commercials. You also get access to our entire archive of every episode dating back a really long time, and plenty of other awesome membership perks. Go to joinpakman.com and use the coupon code BETTER21 for a huge discount. Joinpacman.com. All right. Over the weekend, I was just getting email after email after email from people in the audience saying, David, look, here's another one of these prominent anti-vaxxers who just died of COVID. Here's another one of these prominent anti-maskers who just died of COVID. Here's another one of these Ivermectin people who just died of COVID. I had 3 stories actually planned for today. We're only going to get to 2 of them. And I think these are important to go over for a few different reasons, which we're going to get to. The third one we're actually going to get to tomorrow because it's a little different. It's a militia member who was also anti-mask and anti-vax who died of COVID. But let's just jump right into the first one. We now have the 3rd conservative radio host who condemned the COVID vaccine who has died of COVID. If you didn't understand what was going on and you just zoomed out, you might say, wow, being a right-wing radio host seems really dangerous in the United States in some way. This is Mark Bernier. He was a mainstay on talk radio in Daytona. This is the state of Florida. A conservative Florida radio host who spoke out against COVID vaccines died after a weeks-long fight with the virus, marking the 3rd radio personality to die from coronavirus who publicly rejected vaccines. The death of Mark Bernier, 65, who was a mainstay on talk radio in Daytona, was announced Saturday night by the radio station WNDB that he was affiliated with for 3 decades. It is with great sadness that WNDB and the Southern Stone Communications announced the passing of Mark Bernier, who informed and entertained listeners on WNDB for over 30 years. We kindly ask that privacy is given to Mark's family during this time of grief. I think that it would be more useful if they didn't hide the cause of death in these announcements. It's almost exactly like the Phil Valentine thing, where the radio station statement doesn't mention the anti-vax element and the COVID death. Even if it's not, you don't have to attack the person, but just say, of COVID, folks, let's end this together. Get the vaccine, wear a mask where recommended. There would actually be some more that comes from this that would be useful. Bernier was known for inviting different viewpoints on the show, including Democrats, but had publicly railed against vaccines. The Daytona Beach News Journal reported Bernier had been hospitalized since August 7, when Florida's Democratic Agriculture Commissioner Nikki Fried in July urged people to get vaccines on Twitter by saying the greatest generation had to defeat the Nazis to preserve our way of life. You're only being asked to get a shot, so be a patriot. Bernier replied on the platform, should say, now the U.S. government is acting like Nazis. Get the shot. Died of COVID, likened the vaccine to Nazism, dead of COVID. Okay. Fried is challenging Florida Governor Ron DeSantis in 22, said, my heart goes out to his family and friends. We covered this story previously on August 4th. Another Florida conservative radio host who had criticized the coronavirus vaccine, Dick Farrell, also died from COVID complications. Farrell had worked at several radio stations and was a fill-in anchor on Newsmax. He strongly condemned the vaccine, posting on July 3rd, why take a vaccine promoted by people who lied to you all along about masks, where the virus came from, and the death toll? Of course, there were no lies about masks. In March of 2020, Dr. Fauci said, it's probably not necessary for the general population. By April of 2020, Fauci and everyone else was saying, we now know more, wear the mask. Lied about where the virus came from. That's just lab leak hypothesis stuff that's unproven. And lied about the death toll. It's actually been the state of Florida that has been playing fast and loose with the statistics. And actually, I've mentioned this before, but let me just slightly digress. Over the weekend, I got a bunch of emails from people saying, David, why do Florida's death numbers look so good? Anytime you look at Florida's death count, it's low. It's just collapsed. This is a game Florida is playing, and I told you about it a week and a half ago. What Florida is doing is they are reporting COVID deaths a full week at a time for the previous week. The way most of these websites work is if Florida doesn't report cases for yesterday, it shows up as a 0. If Florida doesn't report cases, deaths for the day before, it shows as 0. So what Florida is constantly doing is saying, okay, it's now August 30th. Here's the death numbers for August 22nd, 23rd, 24th, and 25th. And those go crazy. But then because they've not reported the recent dates, it crashes to almost 0. And then next week, they'll report the numbers for this week. The point is Florida is playing a game where by delaying reporting by a week and doing a week at a time, it always looks like the last 5 to 7 days are just looking really good in Florida. It's just a game. You have to understand that that's what's going on. And now 2 right-wing Florida radio hosts, plus Phil Valentine from, was it Georgia, Tennessee? I think Tennessee. Multiple anti-vax right-wing radio hosts have now died of COVID. Let's go on to the next similar story. We now have also learned not only about a police officer, not only about an anti-vaccine police officer, but an anti-vaccine police captain who was taking Ivermectin to combat COVID-19 has died of COVID-19. This is being reported by Yahoo News. A Georgia police officer who frequently posted anti-vaccine messages on Facebook and took an anti-parasitic drug instead of a vaccine has died of COVID-19. Captain Joe Manning, 57 years old. Remember, we're not talking about 80-year-olds here. Last guy, Mark Bernier, was 65. This police captain was 57. Captain Joe Manning, 57, of the Wayne County Sheriff's Office, died on Wednesday after a short battle with the virus. Sheriff Chuck Mosley said Captain Manning was an integral part of our family, and our hearts are broken. Our love and prayers go forward to his family. Would have been nice to include a get the vaccine, keep your families safe. After the announcement of his death, Facebook posts made by Manning circulated on social media. He posted a couple of different things, summarized here by Ken Klippenstein. I am not vaccinated by choice, and that's my right. He posted that. Joe Manning, truth, it's not the government's job to protect my health. It's the government's job to protect my rights. Of course, everything is misspelled. There's no apostrophes. It's my job to protect my health. When you trade liberty for safety, you end up losing both. Okay, folks, Wayne Feed and Seed has some liquid and paste ivermectin. Get it while supplies last. He was promoting ivermectin, and he has now died of COVID-19. This is, I still see this as a tragedy. I don't see this and go, what a great thing. Now, many of you have been writing in and saying, David, this might actually start to affect elections. If you have Republicans not getting vaccinated at higher rates than Democrats, that means you're going to have Republicans dying at higher rates than Democrats. At a certain point, this could lead to Republicans losing some seats because too many of their voters are dying. You're absolutely right. And if that happens, that's going to happen and it'll be good for Democrats. But I still take no pleasure in the death and suffering of people. There are, some of these people. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about Caleb Wallace, the militia, anti-mask militia dude who died of COVID. As much of a prick as he might be, as much of a doofus as he might be, as much of a terrible person as he might be, he left behind kids and a widow. And at least as far as the kids are concerned, this is not their fault. And now they are left without a dad because of this. So it's very hard for me to take pleasure in that. But I recognize at a certain point, the numbers could actually get so lopsided in terms of Republicans versus Democrats dying that it could affect some races. And in fact, the math of it is that if this continues being really bad in Florida for another 6 to 8 months, you could actually have a partisan gap in Florida bigger in terms of deaths than Ron DeSantis's margin of victory in 2018. I've looked at the numbers before. I'll explain the numbers again. That's not for today. Let's take a quick break. We'll follow up on the Caleb Wallace thing tomorrow, but much more upcoming in mere moments. If you value what we do at the David Pakman Show, remember to support us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/David Pakman Show, where you can get access to behind the scenes videos, the daily bonus show, the commercial-free daily show, as well as special discounts on merch, including hats, hoodies, mugs, and t-shirts. You can support the show for as little as $2 a month. check it out at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. There's a fascinating new chart from the New York Times and the MIT Media Lab, and this compares COVID cases per 100 people, meaning per capita COVID, to how people voted in the 2020 presidential election. And the results are so simple that it's almost surprising. But then once you think about it, once you look at it, you realize actually it's not really that surprising. And the bottom line of the findings are as follows. If there are lots of Trump voters, there's lots of COVID right now over the last month. If there's a medium amount of Trump voters, there's a medium amount of COVID over the last month. And if there aren't that many Trump voters, there's really not that much COVID spreading either. So let's take a look at the image, and very, very nicely put together. So what you're seeing here are 5 separate lines which track new cases per 100,000. So the blue line means there are under 20% Trump voters in the county. This is a county by county thing. If you're not watching, I'm going to describe this to you. And then it goes from the blue line all the way up to the bright red line. That means more than 80% of a county has Trump voters. Now, remember that if you go back to the beginning before we knew much about COVID, early COVID hit the places with the big airports that are directly connected to Asia and Europe. And those are mostly in blue states. So early on at the start of the pandemic, and you look to the left side of the chart in April, you saw that it was blue counties with more COVID because we had this airport-based initial spread. You had New York City, you had Boston, Newark Airport over the water in Jersey, San Francisco, eventually LA, etc. Now, after a year and a half of the pandemic, having vaccines, understanding guidelines, you've essentially seen that since roughly August or September of 2020, it's been the red counties that on a per capita basis are leading the COVID case rates. The more red the county, the more they are leading in terms of cases, and that's not good. The lowest new case rates right now are in the counties with fewer than 20% of the population, less than 20% of the population, fewer than 20% Trump voters. Those are the places with the least COVID, followed by the places with 20 to 40% Trump. And then the places with 40 to 60% Trump voters have more COVID. And then the places with 60 to 80% Trump have more COVID. And the places over the last month with the highest per capita COVID case rates are the counties where more than 80% of the population voted for Donald Trump. And it's not by a small margin. If you look at those 20 or lower percent Trump counties, they only have 25 new cases per 100,000. If you look at the 80+% Trump counties, they have 65 new cases per 100,000. In other words, the big Trump counties have about 2.5, just shy of 3 times the new case rate than do the very Democratic leaning counties. It's truly incredible to see this translate perfectly into virus spread. Now, we expected this. Intuitively, we expected this, but the data shows it cleanly and clearly. Now, you might correctly say, this can't be good for winning elections, right? Like, in other words, if it's mostly your voters who are getting sick and overwhelmingly your voters that are going to the hospital and overwhelmingly your voters that are dying, that probably isn't good for winning elections, right? And you would be completely correct, except Republicans aren't actually trying to win by having more people who agree with them go out and vote. Republicans for a long time and recently and into the future are trying to win by planning to suppress the vote and making it harder for people unlikely to vote for them to actually be able to get a vote counted, not by winning people over on policy ideas. That being said, let's go back to the discussion that we had last week. Last week, we talked about how Florida's death toll now exceeds Ron DeSantis's margin of victory in 2018. Now, it's not relevant yet because that death toll includes children who don't vote, who weren't part of that margin of victory. It includes non-voting adults as well. And it's a mix of Republicans and Democrats. But it is absolutely plausible that over time, the partisan split in deaths, if it continues to shift to where it goes to being, 55% of the deaths are Republicans, 60% of the deaths are Republicans, 70%. Eventually, you could get a partisan gap such that you have enough more additional Republicans dying of COVID that it starts to impact elections. Now, sadly, we can't just look away and say to each their own, let them go and kill themselves, because vaccinated people still can get sick. Not everybody can get vaccinated. Vaccinated people could end up in the hospital. Vaccinated people could end up dying, in part thanks to the increased spread caused by the right-wing anti-vaccine people. But it's a very similar pattern to what we saw with the Spanish flu. Earlier, urban areas got hit harder. We saw that with COVID as well. More because of airports. It's unclear about the effect of the population density, but there may be one. But by the end of the day, by now, what we are seeing is that it's the most conservative areas, the most Trump voting areas, many of which are rural, that are getting hit the hardest. And it's two things. It's the lower rate of vaccination, and it's the higher rate of ignoring all of the guidelines that at this point we have a pretty good understanding of in terms of preventing COVID. So an unsurprising chart, but very informative in terms of it can feel vague. I don't know. We can't see the virus. I'm just with friends. This can't be a bad thing, or I didn't get a shot, but it translates to real world data, and we see it very clearly there. Not a factor here are religious beliefs, but the Republican governor of Mississippi, Tate Reeves, certainly seems to think that that is a factor, and I want to talk about that a little bit next. Mississippi's Governor Tate Reeves says that there's a reason that in Mississippi, people are just kind of going about their business normally, maybe not getting vaccinated as much, etc. And the reason is that because in Mississippi, more people are religious, meaning they believe in an afterlife, they believe in eternal life, they believe in heaven, they are less scared of the virus. This is Governor Tate Reeves. Let's look at the article from Business Insider. Mississippi Governor Tate Reeves, in remarks Saturday, said that people in the state were less scared of COVID because they believe in eternal life, as new infections reach record levels and hospitalizations spike. Now, remember, Mississippi is highly infected and under-resourced. When you look at healthcare quality and access, Mississippi is usually 50th out of 50 states, sometimes 49th. They're engaged in a battle for a race to the bottom with Alabama when it comes to healthcare. Okay, it's a disaster in Mississippi, and the governor is saying, "Well, we believe in an eternal life, so we're not that scared." Reeves made the remarks to a gathering of state Republicans at a fundraiser on Thursday. Quote, "I'm often asked by some of my friends on the other side of the aisle about COVID. And why does it seem like folks in Mississippi and maybe in the Mid-South are a little less scared, shall we say? When you believe in eternal life, when you believe that living on this earth is but a blip on the screen, then you don't have to be so scared of things." Reeves went on to say, "God also tells us to take necessary precautions, and we all have opportunities and abilities to do that, and we should all do that. I encourage everyone to do so." Mississippi has recorded more new COVID cases per capita than any state, around 127 per 100,000, according to an analysis by the New York Times. The wave of infections in Mississippi has put state health services at a breaking point, with 93% of ICU beds in use, 63% of those occupied by COVID patients, according to HHS data. Now, you know, the thing about these kind of claims, we're less scared because this earthly life is only a blip in terms of the total life. This would sort of apply to everything, like seat belts, taking antibiotics when you have a sinus infection or strep throat. And yet most of these people do these things. There are some, like I know Christian Science is very much skeptical of medication and sort of traditional treatment, etc. But this applies to a lot of different things that most of them do. But if you're really going to take this approach, you should really take it fully. Don't take the mealy-mouthed approach. Don't go to the hospital when you get sick, right? Go to church and pray, or even don't do anything, because you're going to more quickly get to that eternal afterlife if you die from whatever is afflicting you. There's also another more sensible approach, which I think I've seen some religious left-wingers take, which is God made the vaccine possible. I'm going to go and get the freaking vaccine, right? When God answers prayers, God may be answering the prayers by giving us a vaccine or giving us masks or giving us ways to attend church safely in our cars or whatever the case may be. It almost starts to take on, like, if you really take this to its full conclusion, it starts to take on kind of this rapture porn ideology of the sooner I die, the sooner I get to heaven. And some of these rapture belief systems take that on. They say, it's going to be so great. I hope that the rapture comes and we all are, that there's fire and fury and whatever else they believe, brimstone. What are the terms they use? I don't remember, because I'm going to get to heaven sooner. I read a tweet from a religious person who said, I believe in eternal life. That's my religious belief. But I believe in taking precautions to avoid COVID because I'm in no rush to exit this life. I don't know if in the afterlife I can be with my kids. I just don't know what that's going to be like. I believe in it, but I don't know what it's going to be. So you know what? I'm going to get the vaccine and I'm going to try to stay safe. It's a completely delusional perspective from Tate Reeves, but it's also being applied hypocritically because a lot of these people, they wear seatbelts and they take antibiotics and they wear a helmet when they ride their motorcycle, whatever the case may be. But yet on this one, they're saying there's no reason to be scared of this because we believe in an afterlife. It's really scary stuff. And unfortunately, it is not an uncommon set of beliefs in the United States. We have a voicemail number, and that number is 219-2-DAVID-P. I have to tell you, I don't really understand this caller. I'm going to play this for you. Maybe we can figure it out together.
Yes, this is Doc from Augusta. And David, I was horrified.
I don't know what's up with the audio, by the way. I'm aware of it.
At your comments about that clip you played with comments about farts and mask wearing. It just really blew me away and left me wondering what you spend your spare time researching. I can only hope that in the future you don't have a clip where somebody claims that masks cannot prevent homosexual intercourse. Come on, David. Later.
Anybody have any idea what that's about? Like, I don't even know what segment it relates to because we talk about masks and I don't know. It's a very, very strange voicemail. If anybody has even the slightest inkling what that might be about, please let me know. On today's bonus show, we will be talking about Hurricane Ida, which hit the Gulf Coast as a Category 4 storm. Cash shortages at ATMs, gas shortages. You can't get cash to buy gas that isn't there anyway to get out. People in dire circumstances in Louisiana and elsewhere. We will discuss that. Reports of cheating at colleges have exploded during the pandemic. Part of it is sort of intuitive. If there's a lot of work from home and test from home stuff happening, it's easier to cheat. But is there something else to it psychologically going on, making people more willing to cheat during COVID? We will talk about that on today's bonus show. And then lastly, many of you requesting this story. And when the people ask for it, I will oblige. Disgraced right-wing darling Milo Yiannopoulos not only has COVID, but apparently has been injecting himself with a dosage of Ivermectin meant for livestock. And even looking at the picture of the syringe that Milo posted, it looks like a pretty wide gauge syringe that it doesn't look like that thin COVID vaccine syringe. I don't know how many needle rather. I don't know how many of you have seen. I know many of you have. You've gotten vaccinated. If you didn't look away when you were getting the COVID vaccine, the needle is incredibly thin. It's almost a perfect needle, I would say. The needle that Milo posted is quite a thick gauge, and I don't know what the hell is going on. But we're going to talk about the latest with Milo and Ivermectin and his COVID and just whether he's trying to use this to mount another comeback. I actually recently engaged, I had a very, very brief email back and forth with Milo a few months ago before he got COVID. I will talk a little bit about that. And then we will also talk about what we believe is the resolution to last week's tech issues. I have some updates on that. I got some very important suggestions from people in the audience. So that's all today on the bonus show. I want to remind you, we may be as little as 24 hours from reaching 1 billion YouTube views on our main YouTube channel. 1 billion YouTube views. It is an incredible milestone. In a sense, it's more impressive than 1 million subscribers. And I will talk about why once we reach the milestone. We have a beautiful video plan that producer Pat put together for us, along with help from Noah. And it's a great video we've got ready. It's queued up and ready to go when we get to that billion. And we will also have a fantastic membership special go out to our newsletter subscribers when we get to that billion views. So make sure you're signed up at davidpakman.com. But before any of that, today's bonus show, join me there. I will see you then. Thanks a lot for watching today's show. I just want to take a second to tell you about today's sponsors. Blinkist is the app that helps you become a more well-rounded person by letting you read or listen to an entire nonfiction book in just 15 minutes. You can try it for free and get 25% off a subscription by going to Blinkist.com/David Pakman.